Welcome to Void of Fears. I've been checking my analytics, and I noticed that 46.5% of you watching right now aren't subscribed yet. We're on the journey to 10k subscribers, and your support would mean everything. If you're enjoying the content, hitting that subscribe button takes just a second and doesn't cost a thing. You can always change your mind later, but your subscription helps this channel grow more than you know. While you're at it, drop a like on this video to help it reach more people who might enjoy facing their fears with us. Now, let's dive into today's story. The wind howled across the Antarctic wasteland, a primal scream that had persisted unchanged for millions of years. It carried ice crystals that stung any exposed skin, like microscopic daggers, reducing visibility to mere feet. Dr. Elias Carter pulled his thermal hood tighter as he stepped off the military transport plane, his breath immediately crystallizing in the brutal cold. At minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, exposed skin would freeze in less than a minute, but the cold wasn't what sent a shiver down his spine as he gazed across the stark white landscape to the NASA expedition camp. The base appeared small and fragile against the vast emptiness of Antarctica, a collection of interconnected domes and prefabricated structures huddled together like survivors in a hostile world. Floodlights cut through the perpetual darkness of Antarctic winter, illuminating swirling snow and the silhouettes of researchers moving between buildings. Something about the frantic pace of their movements suggested urgency or fear. "Dr. Carter, over here." A figure waved frantically from beside an idling snowcat, the massive treaded vehicle that would transport him to the dig site. As Carter trudged through knee-deep snow toward the vehicle, he recognized Nadine Porter, the systems engineer he'd worked with on 3 previous expeditions. Unlike their past collaborations studying ice core samples in Greenland or analyzing permafrost in Siberia, something in her expression made his stomach tighten with apprehension. "Nadine," he greeted her, his voice muffled by his protective mask. "What's got everyone so worked up? The message I received mentioned an anomalous discovery. Nothing more." Nadine's eyes, visible between her hood and breathing apparatus, were wide with excitement or fear. Carter couldn't tell which. Deep shadows beneath them suggested she hadn't slept properly in days. "Nobody wanted to say too much over comms," she replied, helping him secure his equipment in the snowcat storage compartment. "You needed to see this yourself. We've been operating on minimal sleep since we found it." She glanced over her shoulder toward the camp, lowering her voice. "The drilling team broke through to something impossible." The snowcat lurched forward across the ice, its powerful engine struggling against the harsh conditions. Inside the heated cabin, Carter removed his face covering, revealing a weathered face framed by a salt and pepper beard. At 47, he'd spent over 2 decades studying the planet's most remote regions, earning a reputation as one of the world's foremost geophysicists. Yet, nothing in his extensive career had prepared him for Nadine's next words. "3 days ago, our ground-penetrating radar picked up something strange about 2.7 miles down," she explained, her eyes fixed on the windswept landscape ahead. "At first, we thought it was a volcanic formation, or perhaps an unusual mineral deposit, but..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The object has perfect geometric proportions." "Perfect, Elias. And it's not made of any material that should exist at that depth or age." Carter frowned, removing his gloves to accept the tablet Nadine handed him. It displayed radar imagery, showing a rectangular object embedded deep within the Antarctic ice sheet. "What are we talking about here? How old?" Nadine's voice dropped. "Initial dating puts it at approximately 400 million years, Middle Devonian period, Elias. Before dinosaurs, before any complex life had even emerged onto land." Carter stared at her, scientific skepticism immediately surfacing. "That's not possible. Nothing man-made could possibly..." "That's just it," she interrupted. her knuckles white as she gripped the steering controls. Nobody's saying it's man-made. Whatever this is, it predates humanity by hundreds of millions of years. The snowcat fell silent save for the howl of wind outside and the crunch of its treads over the ice. Carter studied the radar images more carefully, noting the object's perfect symmetry and unnatural dimensions. As a scientist, he prided himself on rational thinking, but a cold feeling that had nothing to do with the Antarctic climate settled in his chest. The vehicle crested a final ridge, revealing a sprawling research station nestled in a valley below. Specialized drilling equipment towered over a series of interconnected domes, with researchers scurrying between them like ants servicing a colony. As they approached, Carter spotted Luis Vega, the team's archaeologist, waiting at the entrance to the main research dome. Despite the cold, the man wasn't wearing his hood, his dark hair whipping around his face in the bitter wind. "Dr. Carter," Luis greeted him with a firm handshake as he disembarked from the snowcat. The archaeologist looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept in days. His normally meticulous appearance had given way to a disheveled beard and rumpled cold-weather gear. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "You look like hell, Luis," Carter observed, collecting his equipment. "What's going on here that was worth pulling me out of my university lecture series?" Luis exchanged a meaningful glance with Nadine. "We've established a viewing area around the object. Well, you'll see. We've got it partially excavated, but we're proceeding with extreme caution." The trio entered the main research dome, where Carter was struck by the atmosphere of tense concentration. Dozens of scientists and technicians worked at various stations, their conversations conducted in hushed tones. Wall-mounted screens displayed data streams, thermal imaging, and scanning results, while a large holographic projection in the center showed a three-dimensional model of the ice sheet with the mysterious object highlighted deep within. "We've assembled the best team available on short notice," Nadine explained as they moved through the facility. "Geologists, physicists, material specialists, even a couple of xenobiologists, though that was NASA's addition, not our request." "Xenobiologists?" Carter raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that a bit premature?" Luis shrugged. "After you see this thing, you might not think so." They approached a sealed doorway marked Containment Area, authorized personnel only. A security officer checked their credentials before allowing them through into a decontamination chamber. "We're treating this with highest level biological and radiological protocols," Nadine explained, as they were subjected to a series of scans. "Not because we've detected any hazards, but because we simply don't know what we're dealing with." The trio donned cleanroom suits before entering an airlock that led to an ice tunnel sloping downward. The passage had been carved through the ancient ice with precision, its walls smoothed and reinforced with supporting struts every few meters. Carter noticed electrical cables and monitoring equipment installed along the ceiling, feeding data back to the research dome. "We're about a quarter-mile from the actual excavation site," Luis explained as they walked. "The tunnel extends almost 3 miles, down to where we've partially freed the object. We've been using thermal elements to carefully melt the surrounding ice without damaging whatever it is we've found." After walking for several minutes through the gradually descending tunnel, they reached a transport platform, essentially a small electric cart designed to travel along rails embedded in the ice floor. "The next section is too steep and long to traverse on foot," Nadine explained as they boarded. "Prepare yourself, Elias. What you're about to see will change everything we understand about Earth's history." The platform descended rapidly into the heart of the Antarctic ice sheet, passing through layers of ice that represented tens of thousands of years of Earth's climate history. Carter watched depth markers tick by on a digital display, 1 mile, 2 miles, approaching 3. The air grew noticeably warmer despite their increasing depth, and Carter detected a subtle vibration through the platform's floor. "Do you feel that?" he asked. Luis nodded grimly. It's been getting stronger over the past 24 hours. We thought it might be equipment vibrations at first, but we've ruled that out. It's coming from the object itself, Nadine added quietly. Before Carter could process this information, the transport platform slowed and came to a stop at a large steel door built directly into the ice tunnel. A keypad and retinal scanner secured the entrance. Final security checkpoint, Nadine explained, submitting to the scan. What lies beyond this door has been classified above top secret by both NASA and the military. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing another short tunnel that opened into a vast cavern that had been melted and carved out of the ancient ice. Powerful lights illuminated the space, casting harsh shadows across the frozen walls. Scientific equipment lined the perimeter: spectrometers, radiation detectors, thermal imagers, and dozens of other instruments Carter recognized from cutting-edge research facilities. And there, in the center of the cavern, was the object. Carter froze in his tracks. My God! Rising from the ice like a shard of captured darkness stood a perfect black monolith. Approximately 15 feet tall, 8 feet wide, and 3 feet thick. Its surface was so smooth it seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. Despite the powerful floodlights trained directly on it, Carter could barely make out its contours, as if his eyes refused to focus properly on its form. It doesn't photograph correctly either, Louis said, noting Carter's struggled perception. Digital images come out blurred or distorted. Film cameras produce negatives that develop completely black. It's as if it actively resists documentation. Carter approached slowly, circling the monolith with measured steps. A portion of it, roughly 2/3, had been freed from the surrounding ice, while the lower third remained embedded. The excavation site around it had been carefully constructed, with monitoring equipment positioned at strategic intervals. We've been working round the clock to free it completely from the ice, Luis explained as they approached, but that's not even the strangest part. Carter circled the monolith slowly, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. There were no tool marks, no seams, no indication whatsoever of how it had been manufactured. The material resembled obsidian, but was clearly something else entirely, something unknown to modern science. Have you taken samples? Carter asked, stopping several feet from the object. Nadine nodded. We've tried every method available to us. Laser drills, diamond-tipped bits, even concentrated hydrochloric acid. Nothing makes a mark on it. It's like it's not entirely present in our physical reality. Carter reached out a gloved hand towards the surface. Wait, Louis started to say, but it was too late. Carter's fingers touched the monolith, and he immediately jerked his hand back. It's warm, he whispered in disbelief. In the subzero environment of the Antarctic ice, the object should have been frozen solid. Instead, it radiated a subtle heat, like a living thing. And that's not all, Nadine said, guiding him to a nearby monitoring station. Watch the thermal imaging. On the screen, Carter watched as heat patterns rippled across the monolith's surface, flowing like liquid despite its apparently solid state. More disturbing still, the patterns seemed to respond to proximity, intensifying in the area he had just touched. It reacts to presence, Luis explained, almost like it's aware. Now you see why we called you, Nadine said quietly. Over the next few hours, Carter worked with the team to catalogue the impossible artifact. They established a temporary research dome directly over the excavation site, filled with the most advanced scientific equipment available. Greg Harmon, the team's veteran pilot who had flown in specialized instruments from McMurdo Station, helped set up additional generators to power their growing array of instruments. Whatever this thing is, Greg commented as he calibrated a spectral analyzer, it gives me the creeps. Been flying in Antarctica for 15 years, seen some strange natural phenomena, But nothing like this. It feels like it's watching us. Carter dismissed the comment as he pored over the initial data. The monolith's material composition defied analysis, appearing simultaneously metallic and organic under different tests. The surface absorbed 99.8% of all light directed at it, making it nearly impossible to photograph or scan effectively. Most concerning were the energy readings. Every 47 seconds, the object emitted a subtle pulse of energy, too faint to detect without specialized equipment. "Nadine," Carter called across the dome, "are you getting anything from these energy signatures?" The engineer had been hunched over her equipment for hours, her face illuminated by multiple screens. She looked up, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's broadcasting something, Elias. A pattern of some kind, directed outward in all directions. Some kind of signal." "More structured than that," she replied, gesturing him over to her workstation. "Look at these wavelength distributions. They're too precise, too regular to be natural radiation. It's a transmission of some kind, but using a method I've never encountered before." Luis approached, holding printouts of microscopic scans taken from the monolith's surface. "I found something too. Look at these." The scans revealed intricate patterns etched into the monolith's surface at a microscopic level, symbols or writing of some kind, completely unlike any known human language. The patterns appeared to shift slightly between scans taken only minutes apart, as if the surface itself was subtly changing. "Could it be some sort of message?" Carter suggested, examining the symbols. Luis shook his head. "No human language uses structural patterns like these. The closest analog might be some form of ideographic writing, but even that's a stretch. And remember, this thing predates humanity by hundreds of millions of years." Carter turned to Nadine. "What about dating? You mentioned 400 million years, but what methodology are you using?" "Multiple methods," she replied. "Radiometric dating of the surrounding ice layers, carbon dating of organic particles found near the object, potassium-argon dating of adjacent rock samples. All point to the same approximate time frame, Middle Devonian period." "That's before complex life had even moved onto land," Carter muttered, staring at the monolith. "The most advanced organisms would have been early fish, primitive plants, nothing capable of creating something like this." "Which raises the question," Luis said quietly, "if not natural formation, and not created by any known Earth species, then what?" The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all. The idea was too enormous, too paradigm-shifting to voice aloud in scientific company. But Carter knew they were all thinking it. As the Antarctic night descended outside, the research team worked tirelessly to unravel the monolith's mysteries. Additional scientists arrived from the main research station, bringing specialized equipment and fresh perspectives. Dr. Helena Reeves, a quantum physicist, conducted a series of experiments measuring the monolith's gravitational effects, while Dr. Tariq Rahman, a leading materials scientist, attempted to determine its molecular structure. Around 3:15 p.m., a sudden power surge disrupted all their equipment simultaneously. The lights flickered, computers rebooted, and for a brief moment the temperature in the dome dropped dramatically. Several researchers reported feeling dizzy or disoriented during the event. "What the hell was that?" Greg demanded, checking the generators for damage. Dr. Rahman examined his instruments with growing concern. For about 3 seconds, the monolith's energy output increased by a factor of 20. It was like it was responding to something. Before anyone could investigate further, Nadine called out from her station, her voice tight with tension. "Dr. Carter, I've identified the pattern in the transmissions. It's a sequence, a countdown of some kind." "Countdown to what?" Carter asked, moving quickly to her station. Nadine's fingers flew across her keyboard, running calculations, as data streamed across her monitors. Based on the rate of decrease in the interval patterns, whatever it's counting down to will happen in approximately 36 hours. Carter stared at the monolith, its black surface seeming even darker against the bright lights of the research dome. We need to establish a secure communication link with NASA headquarters. They need to know what we're dealing with here. That night, as most of the team tried to rest in shifts, the strange occurrences began. Carter was awakened by screams coming from Luis's quarters in the small dormitory dome adjacent to the main research area. He and Nadine rushed in to find the archaeologist thrashing in his bed, shouting in a language none of them recognized, a series of harsh consonants and flowing vowels that sounded like nothing on earth. When they finally managed to wake him, Luis stared at them with momentary incomprehension before his eyes cleared. "What happened? Why are you in my room?" "You were screaming," Nadine explained, handing him a glass of water, in some language none of us recognized. Luis looked confused. "I was dreaming about water," he said hesitantly. "Deep water before there was life on land. Something was moving down there, something enormous. I can't really describe it, the shapes were all wrong somehow. And there was a voice that wasn't a voice." Carter exchanged worried glances with Nadine. "You've been working too hard, Luis. Take a couple of hours, get some proper sleep. We'll need you fresh in the morning." As Carter returned to his own quarters, he noticed discolored patches on his hands where he had touched the monolith. The skin appeared darker, with faint line-like patterns spreading outwards from the point of contact like delicate, branching veins. He made a note to run tests in the morning, but felt strangely reluctant to mention it to the others. Sleep eluded him for the remainder of the night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the monolith, felt its unnatural warmth against his fingertips. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, he thought he heard whispering, words just beyond his comprehension, spoken in a language that seemed to resonate within his skull rather than enter through his ears. By dawn, things had grown stranger still. Greg had been discovered outside the research station, standing barefoot in the snow and staring up at the dark Antarctic sky. Despite temperatures of minus 40 degrees, he showed no signs of frostbite or hypothermia when Carter and Nadine led him back inside. "They're waking up," he kept whispering as they guided him to the medical bay. "They've waited so long, so very long." Dr. Jesse Patel, the expedition's physician, examined Greg thoroughly, finding nothing physically wrong besides slightly elevated brain activity. "It's almost like he's in a mild trance state," she explained to Carter. "I've given him a mild sedative. He should rest comfortably for a few hours at least." Tensions rose as the team resumed their work that morning. The monolith's energy pulses had increased in frequency, now occurring every 39 seconds. Nadine reported hearing whispers coming through her headphones when no transmissions were active, sounds that shouldn't have been there, voices speaking in unknown languages. Most concerning, the ice around the monolith had begun to melt at an accelerated rate, creating a growing pool of water despite the sub-freezing ambient temperature. The research team installed pumps to remove the water, but they couldn't keep pace with the melting. That afternoon, while examining an ice core sample taken from near the monolith, Carter experienced his first vision. One moment he was peering through a microscope at ancient ice crystals. The next, his surroundings vanished completely. He found himself floating above an ancient sea, the continents unrecognizable in their Devonian configuration. The sky had a strange greenish tint, the atmosphere of a younger Earth. Below the water's surface he glimpsed movement, something colossal stirring in the depths, something with a geometry that hurt his mind to perceive. It moved with deliberate intelligence, its massive form causing currents that stirred the primitive sea life. As it turned what might have been a head, Carter had the distinct impression it was looking directly at him, across hundreds of millions of years. When the vision ended, he found himself on the floor of the lab, with no memory of falling. Dr. Patel was kneeling beside him, checking his pupils with a pen light. "What happened?" he asked, his mouth dry with fear. "You collapsed," she replied, helping him to a sitting position. "You were unresponsive for almost 3 minutes. How do you feel now?" Carter didn't answer immediately, the vision still vivid in his mind. Finally, he said, "I need to see the latest radar scans of the area beneath the monolith." Luis, meanwhile, had begun obsessively drawing symbols similar to those found on the monolith. His workstation was covered with pages filled with intricate patterns that looked both random and purposeful, like a language designed by non-human intelligence. "I see them when I close my eyes," he explained when Carter questioned him, his hands shaking as he filled another page. "They're not just markings, they're a language, a blueprint. They show the configuration of something vast." Nadine's countdown continued its relentless progress, and by evening, she made a disturbing discovery. The rate was accelerating. Whatever event the monolith was anticipating would arrive sooner than they had calculated, perhaps within 24 hours rather than 36. As Carter examined ice core samples that evening, he noticed something alarming: microscopic metallic fragments embedded in ice layers dating back millions of years. Under analysis, these fragments match the composition of the monolith exactly. "It's not just this one," he realized aloud, calling the team together. "There could be more of these things, scattered across the planet." Their ground-penetrating radar confirmed his worst fears. Below the monolith extended massive hollow chambers, stretching for miles beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. And within those chambers, the radar detected subtle movements, shifts and stirrings that suggested something enormous was changing position after eons of stillness. When they attempted to contact NASA headquarters with their findings, they discovered all satellite communications had mysteriously failed. Radio transmissions encountered severe interference, and their internet connection to the outside world had been severed completely. "It could be the storm," Nadine suggested, though her expression suggested she didn't believe it. The weather had deteriorated significantly over the past hours, with wind speeds approaching hurricane force. "I don't think so," Carter replied grimly. "We're being isolated, cut off. Whether by natural causes or something else, I can't say for certain." That night, the temperature around the monolith rose above freezing, creating a widening pool of water that threatened the stability of their research dome. Carter ordered emergency supports installed, but he knew it was only a temporary measure. The ice beneath their feet was becoming unstable, creating an increasingly dangerous working environment. "We need to evacuate," he told the team during an emergency meeting. "Whatever's happening here, it's accelerating beyond our control. We need to get our data to people who can analyze it properly, and we need to alert authorities about what's happening here." Dr. Rahman objected. "We can't abandon the most significant discovery in human history because of a little melting ice and equipment malfunctions. The scientific value here is incalculable." "This isn't about scientific value anymore," Carter countered, holding up his hand to reveal the spreading dark patterns that now extended almost to his elbow. "Something is happening to us. To all of us. Look at yourselves." The team fell silent as they regarded each other. Luis's eyes had developed a strange reflective quality, catching the light like an animal's. Dr. Patel's normally immaculate appearance had given way to distraction. She'd been unconsciously drawing the same symbols Luis had been documenting. Dr. Reeves reported hearing voices explaining complex theories that shouldn't have made sense but somehow did. "We're being affected by prolonged exposure to the monolith," Carter continued. "We need distance and perspective. Greg, can you get the transport plane ready? We evacuate at first light." Greg prepared the transport plane for emergency departure, but nature or something else had other plans. A sudden, violent storm descended on the research station with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and visibility reduced to zero, making flight impossible. "We're trapped here," Nadine said, her voice hollow as she stared at the weather radar in the communications dome, "at least until the storm passes." But Carter suspected the storm might not be natural. Its epicenter circled their location with an almost deliberate precision, as if intentionally keeping them in place until the countdown reached its conclusion. Greg's behavior grew increasingly erratic as the hours passed. The pilot began muttering about ancient ones stirring and the world being remade. During a particularly fierce blizzard, while Carter and the others were focused on reinforcing the main dome supports, he disappeared from the base entirely. Search parties found no trace of him in the howling, white darkness. "He couldn't have gone far in these conditions," Dr. Patel insisted. "Not without proper gear. He'd freeze to death within minutes." But Carter wasn't convinced. Death still operated by the same rules, this close to the monolith. "Keep searching," he ordered, "and no one goes anywhere alone from now on." The next morning, as the countdown approached its final hours, Luis approached Carter with a theory that chilled him more than the Antarctic winds ever could. The archaeologist had filled dozens of pages with the strange symbols, arranging them in patterns that he claimed had revealed their meaning to him. The monolith wasn't buried by natural processes, Luis explained, spreading his drawings across a table in the main research dome. It was deliberately placed here as a containment device, a lock of sorts. "Look at these structural patterns. They form a three-dimensional lockdown mechanism, designed to neutralize something below." Carter studied the drawings, recognizing elements that corresponded to the microscopic patterns on the monolith's surface. "A lock for what?" "I don't know exactly," Luis admitted, his voice taking on an unsettling cadence. "But the symbols speak of those who came before and the sleeping ones. I believe this object was created to imprison something that existed on Earth long before humans, perhaps even before complex multicellular life." As if confirming his words, a tremor shook the research dome, dislodging equipment and sending hairline cracks through the ice floor. These tremors had been increasing in frequency and strength over the past 12 hours, each one lasting longer than the one before. Dr. Reeves, monitoring seismic activity, reported that the epicenter was directly beneath the monolith, roughly 5 miles below the surface. "It's as if something down there is pushing upward," she explained, her voice tight with tension. Carter organized the remaining team members into shifts, some continuing research while others reinforced their shelters and prepared emergency supplies. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, with wind speeds occasionally topping 120 miles per hour. "If there's something down there," Dr. Rahman asked during a team meeting, "something imprisoned by this monolith, what happens when the countdown ends? What happens if it gets out?" No one had an answer, but the silence spoke volumes. The climax of horror arrived when the team discovered Greg's body. Half submerged in rapidly melting ice nearly a mile from base, the pilot's corpse was preserved in the cold but horribly transformed. Where his eyes should have been were two small, obsidian-like orbs that resembled the material of the monolith. His mouth was frozen open in what might have been a scream or an attempt to speak, and his skin bore the same branching patterns that had appeared on Carter's arm. "The material," Dr. Rahman whispered as they examined the body in the medical bay. "It's spreading through his tissue, converting it." "Converting it to what?" Nadine asked. Before anyone could answer, another tremor shook the research station, this one powerful enough to throw them off their feet. Equipment crashed to the floor, and the lights flickered ominously before emergency generators kicked in. "The countdown," Nadine realized with dawning horror as they picked themselves up. "It's not activating the monolith, it's deactivating it." Carter felt the truth settle over him like a shroud. They had misunderstood everything from the beginning. The monolith wasn't a mysterious artifact left by some ancient civilization. It was a prison lock, a seal designed to contain something unimaginable beneath the ice. And now, after 400 million years, that seal was breaking. He ordered an immediate expedition to the monolith chamber. If they couldn't escape, perhaps they could somehow reinforce the containment, delay whatever was happening until help could arrive. As they made their way through the ice tunnels towards the excavation site, Carter noticed the walls were slick with moisture, the ancient ice melting at an accelerated rate. The air grew warmer with each step deeper into the earth, and a strange odour, something ancient and organic, filled the passage. When they reached the monolith chamber, they found it drastically transformed. The once solid ice floor had largely melted, creating a dark pool that surrounded the monolith like a moat. The object itself had changed as well. Its surface rippled with energy patterns visible to the naked eye, and it emitted a low hum that vibrated through their bones. The energy signature has increased 1,000-fold, Dr. Reeves reported, checking her instruments. It's putting out more radiation than a small nuclear reactor, but none of it is harmful to organic tissue. It's like it's preparing something. Another violent tremor rocked the chamber, longer and more powerful than any before. When it subsided, they discovered a massive crack extending outward from the monolith's base, stretching across the chamber floor and up the ice walls like a lightning bolt frozen in time. "We need to try to stop this," Carter insisted, though he had no idea how to counteract technology created hundreds of millions of years before humans walked the earth. Nadine's monitoring equipment began detecting massive movement from the chambers below. Something enormous was stirring, awakening from an unimaginably long slumber. The sensors indicated a biological mass hundreds of meters in diameter, though its exact shape couldn't be determined. Luis fell into a trance-like state, his hands moving with inhuman precision as he covered every available surface with the symbols from the monolith. His eyes had grown darker, almost solid black, and veins of the same color spread across his skin, like ink in water. "They come," he whispered in a voice not entirely his own. "The first ones. The original inheritors." In desperation, Carter and the remaining team members attempted to somehow reactivate the monolith's containment function, working frantically as the structure around them began to collapse. Ice melted in sheets, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath, enormous organic structures that resembled nothing known to science. Massive tentacle-like appendages, covered in what might have been sensory organs, pressed upward through dissolving ice. "It's not just one organism," Dr. Patel realized as they worked. "It's a colony, a complex ecosystem of interconnected entities, and they're waking up together." As the countdown reached its final minutes, the monolith's pulses merged into a continuous hum that grew steadily higher in pitch. The temperature in the chamber rose dramatically, steam rising from the expanding pool of water. "Everyone out," Carter ordered as a large section of the ceiling collapsed, narrowly missing Dr. Rahman. "Back to the surface now." They retreated through the ice tunnels, pursued by increasing tremors and the sound of ice shattering behind them. When they reached the transport platform, Carter realized Luis wasn't with them. "Where's Luis?" he demanded. "He didn't follow us," Nadine replied, her face pale with fear. "I tried to grab him, but he pushed me away. He's still down there with that thing." Carter made a move to go back, but Dr. Reeves stopped him. "It's too late, Elias. The tunnel is collapsing. We barely got out ourselves." Back at the main research dome, they found the situation deteriorating rapidly. The storm outside had intensified beyond all natural parameters, with wind speeds now exceeding 200 miles per hour. The ice beneath the station was breaking apart, creating fissures that widened by the minute. We need to transmit everything we've learned, Carter decided, leading them to the communications dome. If we can't stop this, at least we can warn the world about what's coming. Nadine worked feverishly to establish a connection to any satellite or radio receiver, while Carter and the others gathered all their data onto portable drives. The countdown on Nadine's monitor showed less than 5 minutes remaining. As the final seconds ticked away, Nadine let out a cry of triumph. "I've got a signal. Weak, but it might be enough for a data burst transmission." In that moment, as the countdown reached 0, the monolith ceased its pulsing entirely. For one brief, hopeful moment, Carter thought perhaps nothing would happen after all. Then, the monolith shattered into perfectly equal fragments, releasing a blinding light that was visible even from the research station a mile away. The ice shelf beneath them began to collapse catastrophically, creating a widening abyss that swallowed equipment, buildings, and people alike. Through a window, Carter watched in horror as Luis walked across the fracturing ice towards the source of the light, his body now more alien than human. He moved with purpose, called by something ancient and patient that had waited hundreds of millions of years for this moment. The communications dome began to tilt as the ice beneath it gave way. In the final moments before evacuation became impossible, Carter recorded a message on Nadine's emergency satellite beacon, praying it would somehow reach civilization. "This is Dr. Elias Carter of the NASA Antarctic Research Expedition." He spoke into the recorder, his voice trembling as the world literally crumbled around them. "Something has been unleashed here, something that existed before humanity, something that was imprisoned in the deep past by forces we don't understand." The floor beneath him cracked, forcing him to grab onto a support beam. Outside, the storm had become a swirling vortex centered directly over the monolith's location. The monolith was never just a relic. It was a ward, a lock, placed here by I don't know what. But I know this much: we weren't the first intelligent species on this planet, and we won't be the last. Carter felt a presence behind him and turned to see Luis, or what had once been Luis, standing in the doorway. His friend's body had transformed, the skin now black and reflective like the monolith's surface. When he spoke, his voice resonated with multiple tones, as if many voices were speaking through him. "They have waited so long," the thing that had been Luis said, "slumbering beneath the ice while your kind rose and spread across their world. Now they reclaim what was always theirs." The transmission ended there, the signal lost as the communications dome collapsed into the widening chasm. 3 days later, satellite imagery detected a massive unknown mass moving beneath the Antarctic waters, heading north toward more populated shores. All attempts to establish communication with the research station failed, returning only static. Military vessels dispatched to investigate found nothing but open ocean where the facility should have been, as if the entire ice shelf had simply vanished. In the endless darkness beneath the world's oceans, something ancient swam once more, free after 400 million years of imprisonment, patient, hungry, awake. And in research facilities around the world, scientists began detecting unusual seismic activity across the globe. Small at first, localized tremors in deep ocean trenches, inexplicable temperature anomalies in abyssal plains, strange behaviors in marine life, whales beaching themselves by the hundreds, deep-sea creatures appearing in shallow waters, fishing vessels reporting bizarre catches, organisms that defied classification, that seemed to dissolve or transform upon exposure to air and sunlight. 2 weeks after the Antarctic disaster, a Japanese research vessel in the South Pacific recorded something massive on sonar, an object or organism nearly 1/2 kilometer in length, moving at depths previously thought uninhabitable by complex life. Their transmissions ended abruptly mid-sentence, and no trace of the ship or its crew was ever found. Similar incidents multiplied across the world's oceans. Ships disappeared without distress signals. Coastal communities reported strange lights beneath the waves at night, and haunting sounds that carried for miles. Not quite whale song, not quite anything recognizable to human ears. Dr. Rebecca Chang of the Oceanic Research Institute organized an emergency conference in Sydney, gathering marine biologists, geologists, and climatologists from across the globe to address the escalating phenomena. Among those invited was Dr. Miranda Lee, formerly Nadine Porter's research partner at NASA, who arrived carrying a hard drive of data recovered from the last transmission sent from Antarctica. The final readings from the Antarctic station are troubling, Dr. Lee explained to the assembled scientists. Before communications failed, Nadine managed to transmit spectrographic analyses of the object they discovered. The material properties defy conventional physics. It exists simultaneously in multiple quantum states and appears capable of affecting organic matter at the cellular level. "Are you suggesting some form of contamination?" Dr. Chang asked, voicing the concern shared by many in the room. Dr. Lee hesitated before responding. "I believe infection might be a more accurate term. The last images from Nadine's transmission showed personnel with unusual physical alterations, darkened skin with branching patterns, ocular transformations, behavioral changes consistent with external influence." The implications hung heavily in the air. If the phenomena was spreading, if humans could be affected, then the situation was far worse than anyone had realized. Dr. Jordan Weber, a marine geologist, projected a map of recent seismic events onto the main screen. "These aren't random," he explained, indicating dozens of pinpoints across the world's oceans. "They follow deep-sea trenches and abyssal plains, but there's a clear pattern of movement. Something is traveling along these routes, triggering localized disturbances." "Or multiple somethings," Dr. Chang added grimly. The conference established a global monitoring network, coordinating research vessels, underwater drones, and satellite tracking to map the spreading phenomena. But they were already too late. On a warm Wednesday evening in October, the coastal city of Port Elizabeth, South Africa experienced the first direct encounter. Witnesses described a massive shape emerging from the water just offshore, something that seemed to shift between different forms as it moved, defying description or a categorization. Local police and emergency services responded to panicked calls, only to find themselves confronting an entity that affected electronic equipment and caused disorientation in anyone who approached too closely. Amateur video footage, shaky and partially corrupted, showed tentacle-like appendages extending hundreds of feet into the air, while what might have been sensory organs pulsed with bioluminescent light. The entity remained for approximately 17 minutes before submerging again, leaving behind dead marine life and a strange residue that local authorities quickly cordoned off. 12 people who had direct visual contact with the entity were hospitalized with symptoms, including severe headaches, visual disturbances, and eventually the same branching patterns on their skin that Dr. Carter had first observed in Antarctica. Within 24 hours, similar emergencies were reported near Auckland, New Zealand, Lima, Peru, and Mozambique. Each incident lasted less than 20 minutes, but each time the entities displayed more coordinated behavior, as if testing boundaries, learning about the world above. Military responses proved ineffective. Conventional weapons seemed to pass through the entities with minimal impact, and proximity to the creatures caused electronic systems to malfunction or shut down completely. Nuclear options were considered, but ultimately rejected. As simulation models suggested, radiation might accelerate whatever transformative processes were occurring, rather than halt them. Dr. Chang, working with international colleagues, established a theory. These entities exist partially outside our conventional understanding of biology. They appear to function at both a macro and quantum level simultaneously, which explains their resistance to conventional weaponry and ability to affect electronic systems. They're not simply creatures, they're complex systems, perhaps even civilizations unto themselves. When asked by military officials how to combat such entities, her answer was blunt. We can't. Not with our current understanding of physics or biology. Whatever imprisoned them 400 million years ago had technology or abilities far beyond our own. Meanwhile, the transformation spread among those exposed to the entities or their residues. The affected individuals exhibited increasing intelligence alongside physical changes, and many began creating devices of unknown purpose from ordinary materials. Attempts to study or contain these individuals failed. They seemed capable of manipulating electronic systems with their minds, walking through walls, or vanishing entirely when threatened. 6 weeks after the initial emergence, these transformed humans began gathering at coastlines around the world, standing in silent communion with the ocean. They no longer responded to friends or family members, no longer identified as human. When approached, they would only say that the original inheritors had returned, and the brief age of mammals was coming to its natural conclusion. Dr. Lee, analysing communications between these transformed individuals, discovered they were speaking the same language Luis had used in his trance state, a language that seemed to operate on principles entirely unlike human linguistics, conveying concepts impossible to translate into any known tongue. World governments established quarantine zones around major emergent sites, but containing the phenomenon proved impossible. More entities emerged daily, each larger and more complex than those before. Some now remained on the surface indefinitely, establishing structures that resembled coral reefs but functioned as something far more sophisticated, transmission nodes perhaps, or terraforming engines. Dr. Lee, whose extensive work with the Antarctic data had given her unique insights, proposed a desperate solution. If these entities were imprisoned once, they can be imprisoned again. The monolith was a key, a lock, and somewhere the technology that created that lock must still exist. A global expedition was organised, searching for signs of similar monoliths or remnants of the civilization that had created them. Archaeological teams scoured ancient sites while deep sea missions explored abyssal trenches for evidence of prehistoric technology. In the mountains of Tibet, a team led by Dr. Weber discovered stone tablets inscribed with symbols matching those found on the Antarctic monolith. The tablets, dated to approximately 25,000 BCE, depicted beings of light imprisoning great shadows beneath the earth. More importantly, they contained coordinates to locations around the world where other keys had been placed. As humanity mobilized its remaining resources to locate these keys, the entities continued their inexorable spread. Cities near coastlines were abandoned, as the ocean itself seemed to come alive with bioluminescent patterns that affected the minds of anyone who gazed upon them for too long. The transformed humans, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, began constructing massive structures at key ley line intersections around the world. Structures that hummed with the same energy signature as the Antarctic monolith. Dr. Chang, whose research facility in Sydney had become one of the last bastions of organised scientific resistance, made a breakthrough in understanding the entity's nature. They're not conquering Earth, she explained to the Emergency World Council. They're reclaiming it. These beings were the dominant life form on this planet for millions of years, before being imprisoned. To them, we're just temporary caretakers whose time has ended, 9 months after the Antarctic incident, with human civilization crumbling, and over 40% of Earth's landmass now transformed into alien ecosystems. Expedition teams successfully located 7 monoliths, similar to the one discovered in Antarctica. Each had been carefully hidden, buried beneath mountains, concealed in deep caves, submerged in inland lakes, and each pulsed with the same energy signature, though much weaker than the original had been. Dr. Lee, working with what remained of the world's scientific community, determined that the monoliths formed a global network, a planetary containment system designed to keep the ancient entities imprisoned in designated zones deep beneath the earth and sea. With the Antarctic monolith destroyed, the entire network had begun to fail. "We need to reactivate the system," she told the Emergency Council. "The monoliths respond to specific energy frequencies. If we can generate a strong enough pulse at exactly the right wavelength, we might be able to strengthen the remaining locks." The plan required sacrificing most of Earth's remaining power infrastructure to generate the necessary energy pulse. With no better options available, world leaders agreed. Massive generators were constructed at each monolith site, drawing power from everything from nuclear plants to hydroelectric dams. As preparations entered their final stage, the entities seemed to sense the threat. Their attacks intensified, focusing specifically on the monolith sites. The transformed humans acted as their agents, sabotaging equipment and overwhelming defensive perimeters through sheer numbers. At the Siberian site, Dr. Weber died holding off waves of transformed humans, while engineers completed the generator installation. His last message, transmitted to the coordination center in Sydney, was simple. "Whatever happens, remember, we weren't the first intelligent species on Earth, but we've earned our place here. Make sure we're not the last humans." On December 21st, 1 year after the Antarctic discovery, the remaining scientists activated the global network. Enormous energy pulses synchronized across the 7 sites, generating a planetary resonance pattern that made the air itself vibrate with power. The transformed humans collapsed simultaneously, while the entities in the oceans and along coastlines recoiled as if struck by an invisible force. For 23 minutes it seemed the plan had worked. The entities began retreating to the oceans, their structures crumbling as the ancient containment reasserted itself. Then, at the Mariana Trench site, something catastrophic occurred. The entity that emerged from the world's deepest ocean trench dwarfed all previous manifestations. Nearly 2 kilometers in height, it seemed less a creature than a living mountain of shifting matter. Where it touched the ocean, water transformed into something else, a liquid that moved with apparent intelligence. The entity absorbed the energy pulse completely, grew still for a moment, then responded with a counterpulse that shattered the Mariana monolith completely. With that key component destroyed, the entire network failed. The remaining monoliths went dark, and the planetary resonance pattern collapsed. In Sydney, as the monitoring system showed the catastrophic failure, Dr. Chang addressed her colleagues one final time. "We tried. Remember that, in whatever comes next, humanity faced extinction. And we did not go quietly. We fought with every tool at our disposal, with all the knowledge we had gathered across our brief history." Dr. Lee, who had been analysing the final data transmissions, looked up with an expression of dawning wonder and terror. "It's not just about reclaiming Earth," she whispered. "The patterns in their structures, the energy signatures, they're building something. A beacon." "A beacon for what?" Dr. Chang asked. "For others," Lee replied. "These aren't the only entities that were imprisoned. There are more elsewhere in the cosmos, and they're coming back." As the entities reclaimed the planet that had once been theirs, humanity retreated to final enclaves in mountain ranges and remote inland regions. Some adapted, finding ways to coexist with the transformed ecosystem by adopting semi-nomadic lifestyles and avoiding direct contact with the altered zones. Others established deep underground facilities, hoping to preserve human knowledge and culture until some future opportunity for resistance presented itself. The transformed humans, their conversion now complete, no longer remembered their former lives or identities. They became intermediaries between the entities and the remaining human population, sometimes delivering cryptic messages or warnings about areas to avoid as the transformation of Earth accelerated. One such messenger, a woman who had once been a schoolteacher in Brisbane, approached a human settlement in the Australian outback. When asked why the entities allowed any humans to survive, her response was unexpected: because you are necessary, not as you are, but as you might become. The great cycle continues: imprisonment, freedom, evolution, imprisonment again. You are not the end of the story, merely its latest chapter. Years passed. The entities continued their work, transforming Earth's atmosphere, oceans, and land masses to more closely resemble the world of 400 million years ago. Yet, they left certain areas untouched, allowing the remaining humans to exist within these designated zones, as if in wildlife preserves. In one such enclave in what had once been the Swiss Alps, Dr. Lee established a research centre dedicated to understanding the entities and their technology. Though most of human civilization had collapsed, knowledge remained humanity's greatest asset. If they could understand how the monoliths had worked, perhaps someday they could recreate the imprisonment. On the 10th anniversary of the Antarctic discovery, as Dr. Lee worked late in her laboratory, a visitor arrived, a transformed human whose features were vaguely familiar. "Luis?" she whispered, recognizing what remained of the archaeologist who had first deciphered the monolith symbols. The being inclined its head in acknowledgement, though it no longer identified with that name. "I bring you information," it said in a voice that resonated strangely in the small room. "The others believe you should know." "Know what?" Dr. Lee asked. "That you were not a mistake," the entity replied. "Your kind, mammals, humans, you were part of the cycle, a necessary stage in planetary evolution. And now you have a choice to make." "What choice?" The being approached her workbench, where fragments of a substance resembling the monolith material lay arranged for study. With a gesture, the fragments rearranged themselves into a small-scale model of the original Antarctic monolith. "You can continue as you are, dwindling slowly toward extinction," it said, "or you can accept transformation and join what comes next. The original inheritors did not create the monoliths. They were imprisoned by them, just as they had imprisoned those who came before. It is the great cycle of Earth: rise, dominance, replacement. Now the cycle turns again." "And if we find a way to imprison your kind once more?" Dr. Lee asked defiantly. The being that had been Luis made a sound that might have been laughter. "Then you will have earned another age of dominance, until the next turning of the cycle. That is the true message of the monolith. Not a warning, but a challenge. A test to determine if your species is ready for the next stage of cosmic awareness." Dr. Lee stared at the miniature monolith, understanding dawning in her eyes. It wasn't just a prison, it was a test. "Everything is a test," the entity replied. "That is the nature of evolution. And somewhere, watching from the spaces between stars, those who built the original prisons are waiting to see which species proves worthy of joining them." As the entity departed, Dr. Lee turned to her research with renewed purpose. Humanity stood at a crossroads, facing extinction, transformation, or perhaps a third path not yet imagined. The monolith had not just been a warning about ancient horrors returning. It had been a challenge, a cosmic examination to determine if humans could solve the puzzle that had been set before them 400 million years in advance. The great cycle would continue, with or without humanity. But as Dr. Lee activated her equipment and began a new series of experiments, she allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten: hope. Not just for survival, but for understanding, for whatever lay beyond the test. In the depths of the transformed oceans, in the altered atmospheres of what had once been human cities, the entities continued their work. Patient, ancient, awake. And somewhere in the black void between distant stars, something else watched and waited to see which species would next pass the test of the monolith.